Picture this moment. Seasoned mountaineer Viktor Rozanov sets out to climb Rocky Mountain, the last peak of his career, which no one has been able to conquer in decades. But after only a few hours of climbing, he encounters something far more dangerous than just unpredictable weather. Lightning, snow, icy wind. All this becomes just a backdrop for his determination to continue. And at the very moment when he decides to go further, the connection with the world is broken. Where is Viktor? Why do his tracks disappear into thin air and the search reaches a dead end? Who could be behind this if an experienced climber disappears without a trace? Strange signs, mysterious tracks, and silent mountains. What do the Carpathians hide? Stay tuned to find out how this story ends. And don't forget to subscribe if you want more. Viktor Rozanov stood at the foot of Skalista Gora, one of the most dangerous peaks of the Carpathians. His gaze was fixed on the summit, hidden in the clouds, and he felt in his chest the usual excitement that he always felt before each new ascent. This was his last chance to set a record on this mountain, a peak that no one had been able to conquer in recent decades. He knew that the mountain required respect and attention, but Viktor was confident in his abilities. He had been preparing for this ascent for a long time. Many routes had been completed. All possible technical and safety techniques had been worked out. The equipment had been checked down to the last detail. Viktor was an experienced climber. His name had long been known in professional circles, and this expedition was to become the culmination of his career. There was no room for doubt in his head, only confidence in success. The weather looks like it's holding up, he told himself, checking the latest weather data his partner had sent him via satellite phone. But even though the forecast didn't promise catastrophic changes, his intuition told him that unknown dangers lay ahead. The weather in the Carpathians could be treacherous. A storm could rise in a couple of hours, and then neither experience nor equipment would save you. But Viktor knew that you could always count on this. Experience told him that if you distribute your strength and time wisely, the mountains will not be able to take you. Having collected his backpack and a few last things in the tent, he chose a moment when the clouds had cleared a little and began to climb. Calmly, measuredly, each step measured, each stop calculated to save strength. Everything around was absorbed in snowy silence. Only the wind shook the dry pines, echoing in the empty forest. The altitude was increasing, but the feeling of lightness and strength did not leave Viktor. He was in his element. As he passed rock ridges and glaciers, he felt the tension building in his chest give way to inspiration. The mountain peaks, hidden in the clouds, beckoned to him, promising challenges, but also rewards for his efforts. He knew he had to do it. He had to be the first. The first night in the mountains passed quietly, like all the others in his climbing career. Viktor pitched his tent on one of the passes, lit a small fire, and ate breakfast. It was unusually quiet, without the noise of nature that usually fills the mountain regions. Something is wrong with the weather, he thought, although he quickly brushed these thoughts away. He knew that every climber at some point begins to perceive nature differently. This was his moment of survival, his fear and his confidence that everything was under control. About an hour after breakfast, Viktor decided to continue his journey. He checked his satellite phone from time to time to make sure the connection was still intact, as it was important to be able to track him in case of unforeseen circumstances. His last entry on the screen was short. Everything is fine. The weather is holding, continuing the ascent. He moved forward along the ridge, checking the route on the map, but gradually his confidence began to wane. The rocks became increasingly difficult to pass, and the precipitation, which had started as light snow, quickly increased in intensity. It seemed that the Carpathians wanted to test his strength. At first it was just annoyance that the snow was hindering his progress. But after a few hours, as the wind picked up, he realized that it would be difficult to continue without risking his own safety. He paused, sat down on a rock, took a thermos of tea and a couple of sandwiches out of his backpack, and thought about what to do next. It was about 5 o'clock in the evening, and it was already getting dark. With every step, Viktor felt the clouds gathering around him. The thought flashed through his head. Maybe it would be better to find a place to spend the night and wait out the storm. But this was not the Viktor. He could not allow himself to give up. The weather, the nature, they were not an obstacle for him. He clutched his backpack in his hands and continued on his way. The weather would not stop him. All he felt was the desire to reach the top, to feel it under his feet, to be the first. There was strength in this decision, but also madness. His last contact with the outside world was recorded in his phone. "I continue my journey. The weather will not stop me." These were the last words Viktor sent home. A few hours later, the connection was cut off. When the search party began looking for Viktor Rozanov, expectations were high. His friends, climbers, rescuers, and even local residents of the Carpathians were preparing for this moment. They knew that Viktor was an experienced professional who could cope with any difficulties. However, with each day of fruitless searching, the tension grew. The search began 2 days after contact with Viktor was lost. It was known that Viktor had continued on his way despite the worsening weather, but no one knew exactly where he was or what obstacles he had encountered along the way. His route through the difficult mountain terrain had become difficult to find. The Carpathian expanses, due to their natural complexity, were becoming increasingly insurmountable, and snowfalls and strong winds made the task of finding him even more difficult. The rescue team, led by seasoned leader Pavel Karpenko, assigned responsibilities, starting with a survey of the areas where Viktor had last been seen. "He couldn't have just disappeared," Karpenko told his colleagues as he strode confidently along the trails. "We'll find him, even if we have to search the entire area." That's his strength, not getting lost in these conditions. Karpenko was an old friend of Viktor's, and this gave his actions a special determination. Despite this, Everyone understood that with each passing hour, the chances of finding the climber alive were decreasing. Normal rescue operations in such cases could last several weeks, but in the Carpathian conditions, where the peaks are hidden in fog and the paths are barely visible under the snow, each day brought new problems. In the morning, the group split into two teams. One explored the area where, according to satellite data, Viktor's last point of contact could have been, and the second checked the complex and remote route he could have taken further. Hour after hour, day after day, the searchers moved through the mountains. The snow became denser and visibility decreased. Only rare tracks remained from people who had walked along these paths. No obvious signs were found that Viktor might have gone in any of the directions. Meanwhile, on the other side of the group, Irina, an experienced rescuer and longtime friend of Viktor's, looked warily at the map. She was among those assigned to search the most difficult areas. The weather was getting worse, but one thing caught her attention, which led her to think about possible errors in Viktor's calculations. If he went to a certain pass, it would mean much more risks, but also the opportunity to get to one of the secluded places in the mountains. He was confident, but even the most experienced can make mistakes, Irina thought, looking closely at the tracks in the snow. She decided to move along the trail, checking for possible changes in the terrain that could cause a misorientation. On the fourth day of the search, the group decided to conduct a more in-depth survey, starting with the areas with the highest risks. A sharp deterioration in the weather created additional difficulties. It was unknown what exactly could have happened to Viktor. Perhaps he had to stop and wait out the snowstorm, but why were his tracks not found? Irina was the first to notice the strange turn in the search. Under a deep layer of snow, she came across what looked like a damaged piece of equipment. It was a small piece of rope, slightly frayed, but clearly left over from a recent hike. It turned out to be part of Viktor's last used gear, left right on one of the rocks. So he was here, she said, peering at the landscape. The deeper they went into the search, the more the tracks became unclear, blurred, as if nature itself was trying to hide them. With each step, the rescuers felt growing anxiety. In these mountains, sometimes even unable to check the maps, not only the landmark was lost, but also the certainty that Viktor was alive. As the day turned to night, a sense of uncertainty began to grip the group. Each morning, they rose and continued their search, but with each new step, the certainty that it was still possible to find Viktor alive faded. It was a moment when every minute seemed like a last hope. On the sixth day, Irina found tracks again, but not from Viktor. These tracks could not belong to him. Too light, and without any signs of heavy steps of a climber, not indicating great effort and fatigue. Looking up, she saw something strange in a remote part of the trail, where the tracks seemed to disappear. It was a place where, perhaps, an ordinary tourist could not go. At that moment, Irina understood that for the rescuers and for themselves, the Carpathian Mountains were not just a dull, implacable object, but something living and changeable. Nature could hide everything, even the most experienced climber. They didn't give up, but it wasn't just the weather that was angry. The mountain itself began to feel unpredictable and dangerous. Day 7. The Carpathians tightened their grip on the searchers. Viktor Rozanov was a climber with an impeccable record, and his disappearance came as a shock to everyone who knew him. Every decision made on this search route was vital, and the rescue team knew there was no room for error. Nature did not, but at some point, there was a turnaround. Irina, increasingly absorbed in her search, came across a little trick that Viktor usually used in such situations: a piece of rope hanging from one of the tree branches. There was no doubt about it. It was a sign. She knew that Viktor had probably left it there in the hope that someone would find it. But it also meant that he was within easy reach. "He's nearby," Irina whispered. Pavel came closer and carefully examined the place. The tracks ended at the foot of the slopes, where snow and ice left only blurred prints. The difficulty of the route was increasing, and predictions that Viktor could be just a few kilometers from this point seemed less and less realistic. "We've come too far from where we started," Karpenko said. He was tired, but his eyes were still steady. "We'd have to go back and try again." The group decided to return to the starting point and recheck the remaining sections. For more than one day, the searchers had been haunted by a strange uncertainty that they were moving along the right path. Perhaps they had long passed the necessary section without even noticing it. But time after time, nothing significant was found. The difficulties of following the mountain slopes were not easy and began to test everyone's endurance. The wind was stronger than ever, and it seemed that Viktor's tracks were becoming increasingly ghostly. The rescuers walked along heavily snow-covered slopes, carrying heavy equipment, and their every move was made more difficult by snow and icy rocks that tore off the surface with every step. In this long search, where every step became a struggle with nature itself, the rescuers could not stop, because every moment in the mountains was dangerous. They continued to work, holding back the panic feeling that Viktor might no longer be alive. But with every new breath and every effort, they believed that it was not too late, that their search could lead to success. Before the day was over, everything could change. On the 8th day at night, Pavel sat by the fire, deciding to stop the search for a while to give the team a chance to rest. Thoughts were running through his head that it would be harder to continue than it seemed. He knew that they had already found almost all possible traces, and that each day made the task more difficult. He thought about Viktor, his determination, his experience, and what could have happened to him. "If I were in his place," Pavel said to himself, looking into the fire, "I would not give up. It is not so easy to lead Rozanov astray." Irina walked over to him, sitting down on the ground next to him. She knew it had been a tough night for everyone. Despite their determination, they both felt the pressure building. "We have to keep going," Irina said, looking at the fire. "We can't stop. He's out there somewhere, Pavel. He'll survive if we find him in time." Viktor Rozanov, despite all his strength and knowledge, found himself confronted with something much greater than just mountain conditions. With each passing hour, the searchers became more and more convinced. They were not simply looking for a man, they were looking for something more. Several days passed, and again the night brought with it the question, will we find him? But the next morning, hope returned. Irina noticed something in the distance that could be an important clue. It was a new trail, and although it was not obvious, it was what they were looking for. Every discovery, every find in these mountains could be the final key that would unlock the secret hidden in the snowy wastes. And until Viktor was found, the team continued searching, never giving up. Each following morning put their resolve on the line again. No difficulties or losses could stop the search. Wind and snow, rocks and ice. This was only the beginning of the path that had to be taken to find the answer. But now, after days of searching, the rescuers knew one thing. They were close, and every day brought them closer to their goal. Day 9, the rescue team was back on the trail. The weather had not improved during the search, and each new day brought only uncertainty. Snow continued to fall, and strong winds sometimes blew people off their feet. At first glance, this place seemed cozy and inhabited by mountain paths, but now the mountains had become a dark, unfriendly world that stubbornly refused to give up its secrets. Irina and Pavel stood at the foot of one of the most difficult passes, where the entire group thought Viktor might stop to wait for better weather. This could be the last hope, Irina said, looking around the snowy slope. But her words were filled with doubt. No words could hide the feeling that they had missed something important, that they might not be able to find him alive. Pavel looked at her with tired eyes. His face was worn down by sleepless nights, endless days of searching and constant obstacles. We could have passed by, he said, but if Viktor is still alive, he will fight to the end. And we must not give up. They continued to explore the area, but every hour spent in this mountainous and almost empty wasteland made them doubt more and more. Somewhere in the back of their minds, the question arose more and more often. Is it too late? How long could he survive in such conditions? Irina noticed tracks, thin and almost indistinguishable. Tracks that led to a cliff where rocks and snow lay tightly on top of each other. It was a corner that was difficult to hit without special equipment. She came closer, carefully examining every inch of the ground. Those are definitely his tracks, she said with certainty. But something about the tracks confused her. Viktor didn't seem to be moving any further. It was as if he had suddenly stopped. He stayed here, she added, turning to Pavel. But Pavel did not answer right away. His eyes followed the tracks, and something inside him stirred. He understood. The tracks should not have stopped here. He was sure that he should have found something more, but all he found was empty space and snow, which was hiding the tracks with each passing minute. Something's wrong, Pavel said, turning and looking at Ira. He felt like they could go around this corner, check the tracks, and continue on. But everything around them, even the air itself, seemed to be pressing down on them. This feeling that something was hiding, something that was not visible to the naked eye, continued to haunt him. Hour after hour, the searchers moved through the area where the tracks seemed to have disappeared. The snow, which fell tirelessly, continued to hide everything that could provide an answer. It was only after several hours, when the team decided to conduct an additional check in another area, that they found the first sign of something strange. On a rock a little higher up, Irina noticed a backpack. It was translucent from the snow, but its shape left no doubt. It was Viktor's backpack. But when they climbed up and began to examine it, horror seized them. All his belongings were untouched. "That's weird," Pavel said, examining the backpack. He knew that Viktor couldn't have left everything he was carrying with him. The open flask, lying alone in the snow, seemed like a cinematic detail left there specifically to hide something. But what exactly? Irina nodded silently. This moment made her heart clench. The feeling that Viktor had been here a few days ago, that he had left traces, could not help but be alarming. "We need to go back, Pavel," Irina said, but her voice was quiet, as if she herself did not believe what she said. "Let's go," he responded, although he himself was ready to go further. But the understanding that there could be more than just tracks here made him move faster than he should have. Irina and Pavel turned to the rest of the group. Several rescuers had already arrived, and their faces were puzzled. Viktor's backpack was a frightening sign to them. The strange circumstances, the missing tracks, the equipment that had not been touched. All of this suggested that there was an important element missing from this story. Pavel, having examined the backpack one last time, and having looked closely at the surrounding landscape, realized that Viktor had been just a few steps away from the place where they had found his things and had not returned. What had happened? This remained the most important question, to which there was no answer. The rescuers resolutely continued to explore the area, but each place they found, each new trace, seemed to leave more questions than answers. The Carpathians, despite their apparent impartiality, hid too many secrets. What was behind Viktor's disappearance? There was no time for empty hypotheses. The answers remained far out of their reach, and the snow continued to hide the truth. On the 10th day of the search, the rescuers began to feel how growing fatigue and uncertainty were beginning to destroy their resolve. Wet clothes, damp fingers, tension and silence between them. All this overshadowed the desire to find Viktor. Even the most experienced climbers with whom Pavel and Irina worked began to lose faith in the success of the operation. The weather did not improve, the snow continued to fall, and each new day brought more doubts. But this day, the 10th since the search began, was different. After they found Viktor's backpack, equipment that remained without traces, the team decided to conduct a deeper investigation of the place where Viktor might be. Irina and Pavel knew that one wrong step and they could miss it, as they had already come across several tracks that disappeared, as if they had never existed. Irina, as before, could not shake the feeling that they were close after all. She felt that Viktor had left clues that they could understand, if only they had more time and energy. "He's still there," Irina said, looking around the deserted slope. "I'm sure of it. If he were dead, his tracks would be much clearer. He was hiding. He might not be able to move, but he's definitely alive. We can't give up our positions." As if on cue, Pavel, bending over the place where the backpack was found, noticed something unusual. A few meters away, in the snow, there was a barely noticeable trace. It was the trace of Viktor's shoes, or at least the traces left by someone who was moving in the same direction. "Irina, look." Pavel pointed to a trail that stretched toward the forest. It was the first more or less obvious trail in several days. Irina, without wasting time, immediately followed the tracks. She walked carefully, but her heart was beating faster than usual. These tracks could be false, could lead to nowhere. But this was a chance, and she could not miss it. Everything was quiet around, the snow falling from the trees, the sound of the wind in the tops of the pines. There was not a sound that would disturb this state of expectation. It seemed as if the whole world held its breath. Irina and Pavel walked step by step, watching the tracks that were becoming more and more obvious. It was like lifting the veil from something hidden. Viktor was apparently moving towards the forest. This was his path, his way of hiding from the stormy weather, from the cold, from everything that could kill him. However, as they went deeper into the forest, the tracks became weaker and the weather worsened. The wind grew stronger, the snow became denser, and every minute spent in these places became risky. Nevertheless, Irina and Pavel continued walking, hoping for the best. Suddenly, at one of the turns of the forest path, Irina froze. She saw him, Viktor. He was almost unrecognizable. His face was pale, and his clothes in the snow barely hid his emaciated body. He sat leaning against a tree, as if trying to hide from the raging elements. "Viktor!" Irina screamed, running up to him. Pavel hurried after him. He immediately realized that Viktor was in a serious condition. His breathing was intermittent, and his eyes were clouded. "What happened? Where were you?" Pavel knelt down next to him, trying to examine him. Viktor opened his eyes and looked at them with difficulty. I thought I wouldn't be able to make it." His voice was weak, but he was alive. Viktor even tried to smile, but with difficulty. "You can still do this." Irina took his hand, trying to help him stand up. "You survived this. We found you." But Viktor didn't answer. He tried to get up, but with each movement his body weakly resisted. Pavel and Irina realized that he was exhausted to the limit. "We need to get him back urgently," Pavel said. "We took him too late, but he's alive, and that's the main thing." Pavel quickly prepared a sleeping bag, and Irina helped Viktor stand up with his help. He was almost exhausted, but they took a few steps towards the camp. With each step, Viktor became weaker. His body demanded rest. When they finally returned to camp, Viktor was taken to the rescue camp, where he was immediately treated. He was on the verge of frostbite, exhausted and badly injured. But the fact that he was alive made everyone feel incredible joy and relief. Irina and Pavel sat next to him, waiting for the doctors to begin treatment. They knew they had done the impossible. They had found him. But this success was not complete, because Viktor had survived a terrible ordeal and now faced a long recovery. Each of them was exhausted, but they all understood that this was a victory that was not guaranteed. "You're back with us," Irina said when Viktor opened his eyes and looked at her again. "You survived it. you're back again." Victor nodded slowly. He knew that this was only the beginning of a long road to full recovery. But the moment he was found, he felt that the victory belonged not only to him, but also to those who did not give up and continued searching despite all the difficulties. Pavel, sitting nearby, sighed with relief. In this cruel, endless, snowy wasteland, where everything seemed abandoned and lifeless, they all found what they were looking for: hope, fear, a battle with nature, and, finally, the long-awaited salvation. Victor opened his eyes in the tent, feeling warm for the first time in days. His body was wrapped in blankets, and his face was swollen from frostbite. He was lying on something soft, but everything felt strange to him, like returning to a world that was not his. At first, his thoughts were confused, but when he remembered where he was and that he had been found, he felt a slight pain, not from his body, but from his mind, which was trying to come to its senses. Irina sat next to him, quietly talking to the doctor. She watched his every move, every word and glance he sent her way seemed significant to her. Saved, but not yet saved. Much time had to pass before he became the same Victor who conquered the peaks. His body was exhausted, but his spirit was still strong. "You're safe, Victor," Irina said when he opened his eyes again. "We found you. Everything will be okay." He tried to say something, but his lips wouldn't obey him. Victor felt his thoughts getting confused again. He tried to remember how he got into this state, what had happened to him in those few days when he lost his bearings and rescuers. Only fragments remained in his memory. He remembered how he kept moving forward, hoping that he could find salvation. But then darkness came. His body gave out, and he sank into the snow. "You don't need to talk," said Pavel, who had just entered the tent. He leaned toward Victor and lowered his voice. "You've been through the worst. We need time to recover." Victor felt very weak, but at the same time, there was great gratitude. He thanked everyone for their persistence and for not abandoning him. At first, he doubted that anyone would come for him when the weather worsened and the mountains turned into a giant void where there was no place for the weak. "I didn't think I could survive," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "When I stopped, I thought that was it." "You did it, Victor. You survived," Irina said, her words like gentle encouragement. "You were found. We're all here." That day was the first in his recovery, the days when his body was beginning to come to its senses again, and his mind was trying to find even the slightest explanation for what had happened. His eyes, filled with fatigue, slid around the tent. He felt the pain in his legs and arms growing, and his consciousness was slowly trying to collect all the scattered memories. For the first 2 days at the camp, Victor was virtually helpless. Doctors stabilized his condition, administering painkillers and supportive drugs that allowed his body to function. But physical recovery was only part of the journey he had to go through. "You were very close to death," one of the doctors said as he examined him. "Your frostbite is quite severe, but we made it in time. You are on the road to recovery again." "But how?" Victor breathed out, struggling to understand. "How did I get to this point where all these days in emptiness? Irina and Pavel listened to his words in silence. They understood that the recovery would be long and difficult, but they knew that Viktor had survived it thanks to his willpower. He was not just a climber, he was a survivor. As Viktor recovered, when Viktor was finally able to sit up in the tent, his thoughts became a little clearer. He began to remember details, how, saving his strength, he took a risky path and how the weather continued to worsen. He remembered how he fought for every step, knowing that each new day could be his last. But at some point, he felt that he could go no further. He made the decision to take shelter, to wait out the storm. But the storm did not end. He lost his bearings and could not find his way back. "Why didn't you come back?" Viktor asked with pain in his voice. "Why didn't you look for me where I was, but immediately went along a different route?" "We were looking. We couldn't know you went there," Pavel said. "But now you're here. The main thing is that you're here." He felt relief at these words. At one point, it really did seem to him that he had been forgotten and abandoned by the mountain, which did not give its explorers answers. Now, with each day that he recovered, with his body beginning to return to normal and his mind processing what had happened, Viktor understood that his greatest victory was not in climbing to the top of the mountain, but in surviving. Little did he know that his journey to the most difficult peak, which almost ended in tragedy, would teach him an important lesson. Sometimes the path to survival lies not through physical struggle, but through the inner determination not to give up. Irina and Pavel knew that Viktor was still struggling with himself, with the thoughts that could suppress him. But they also knew that as soon as he was ready, he would return to mountaineering and once again step onto the peaks that had previously seemed impossible. But for him, one thing was more important. At the moment when nature almost won, he remained alive. It had been 3 weeks since Viktor had been found. His recovery had been painful, but inevitable. His body, despite slowly regaining strength, remained weakened. He had learned to walk again, but every step sent pain down his legs, and his hands would lose feeling if he used them for too long. However, Viktor was still grateful for the opportunity to return to life, despite the physical pain and the long road to recovery. He felt that he needed time to become himself again. He continued to train, rebuilding his muscles, but he also knew that during this time, he needed to rebuild his confidence. With each passing day, with each step, his thoughts became clearer. He remembered his fight with the weather, his fight with himself, his fight not to give up. He understood that his survival was not just a fluke. At that moment, when his strength was almost exhausted, he made a decision that allowed him to survive. He found refuge in nature itself, in what gave him the strength to continue even when all other resources were exhausted. But the price of this survival was high. Viktor realized that his body was much weaker than it had been before. His former self-confidence, his ability to survive in any conditions, now seemed distant. He was no longer who he had been before, and this realization weighed heavily on him. With each new day, he felt his consciousness recovering, but thoughts of loneliness, of the fear that he would not be found, haunted him. The fear that he could be alone, fight to the end and not win, was what took all his strength. No matter how much he tried to avoid these thoughts, they did not leave him. Irina and Pavel did not back down. They were there for him, supporting him, but also trying to give him time to recover. Viktor knew that they were worried about him. There was no pressure from them. They gave him space to come back to himself. One day, when his physical condition had improved significantly, Irina approached him and quietly said, "Viktor, you know that you can return to the mountains. Your strength is not only in physical endurance. Your spirit and determination are stronger than any pain you have ever experienced. This is your freedom. You have won, and now it is up to you to decide what to do next." Viktor looked at her and felt something awaken inside him. He had always known that he had to make his own choices. He understood that if he wanted to return to his life, if he wanted to climb the alpine peaks again, he had to do it himself. He could not be controlled by his fears, his doubts. With each passing day, his confidence began to return. He began to train, gradually regaining his physical fitness. But the hardest part was inside, regaining his mental stability, accepting that he had gone through such a struggle, and that now he had to learn to live in a new way. At some point, when the last night of searching could already be heard in the tent camp, when the rescuers began to gather to return home, Viktor decided that he was ready. "I'll go with you," he told Pavel and Irina, who were already preparing to leave. "I'll be back. I'll do it again." Irina looked at him with a soft smile, and Pavel, standing next to him, nodded. He knew that Viktor, despite his vulnerability, had become himself again, the man who does not give up. It wasn't just a decision to return to the mountains. It was a decision to return to a life unconquered by fear and pain. Viktor knew that returning to the mountains and setting a new goal was his path to freedom. It was not only a victory over nature, but also a victory over himself. They all returned home, but Viktor was no longer the same man who had gone to the Carpathians a few weeks earlier. He was changed, but with that change, he had gained a new outlook on his life, his powers, and the world around him. This path was difficult, but it led him to the understanding that, despite the most difficult trials, freedom is not a physical state. It is a state of mind that gives the opportunity to move forward, despite everything. And Viktor knew that there would now be a new path in his life, a path that would begin with continuing to live, despite all the difficulties, and to seek new heights as before. Several months have passed since Viktor Rozanov returned from the Carpathians. The recovery was long, and every minute on the road to full recovery required willpower, but his life was gradually returning to normal. He returned to his work, returned to his friends and colleagues, and even began to go to the mountains again, but not with the same ambitions and desire to conquer the peaks as before. Viktor made a decision. Mountaineering would no longer be his main goal. He would no longer strive for victories. He would no longer look for what he needed to prove. He knew that nature does not forgive mistakes, and he understood that every step in these mountains could be the last. So instead of looking for records and victories again, he began to appreciate the moment, every step, every breath, every moment spent with those who are important to him. But one thing remained constant: the Carpathians, this mountain, and the traces he left in them did not let him go. Viktor continued to work with young climbers, teaching them the basics of safe climbing. He could not forget the moment when his own knowledge and skills did not help him make the right decision in time. Now, his task was to prevent others from making mistakes, to pass on the experience he had acquired with such difficulties. But there was still some elusive anxiety in him that one day he would return to these mountains again. One day, 6 months after the rescue, Viktor returned to the places where the search had begun and where he had been found. He came alone, without the company of rescuers, without Irina or Pavel. He came for himself to understand that all of this had really happened. There were no tourists, no alarm. Everything was quiet and calm. The snow had long since melted, and the wind was blowing across the mountains as before. But he felt a strange calm. The Viktor who had gone to the Carpathians was not the same person who had returned. He returned different, alive, changed, but with the understanding that time never returns. There would no longer be that youthful striving for the heights in his life, only an endless search for inner balance. He sat in the very place where he had been found. He looked into the distance, into the emptiness of the mountains, and felt how this place was still with him, even after so much time. The mountains were silent. They did not give him their secrets, did not reveal what had happened to him in recent days. All these questions that Viktor asked himself and others remained unanswered. The weather did not give him any new discoveries, nor mystical, insightful revelations. And yet, no matter how hard he tried to escape from them, these places remained with him. The questions did not disappear. He did not know why nature was so cruel, why his survival was so unusual. He did not know what would have happened if the rescuers had not found him in time, if not for Irina and Pavel, if not for his desire to survive. These moments were so fragile, so unpredictable. But what he does know is that he is alive, and that he no longer searches for meaning in what happened. He does not try to find answers because he understands that answers do not always come. Sometimes life only gives you moments to live through, and when those moments pass, you can understand that the greatest victory is simply staying alive, despite everything. He stood up and looked at the peaks that had once beckoned him so. From their heights, the world seemed small and clear, but now they were just part of a large, unknown world in which there always remained something invisible, intangible, and it didn't matter. He turned and walked down the path, knowing he would always remember this path. the path that had brought him to life, but that had left no trace. The mountains were silent, but they were a part of him, a part of his story. And even though he didn't know what had happened to him in his last days, he knew he had survived. And that was all that mattered.